So let's go ahead and head into our next cluster of disorders. We're going to be talking about eating disorders and schizophrenia in this particular unit. So as a reminder, we're going to be covering some topics around eating disorders, including binging and purging. So just be aware that that's on the plate. So when we're talking about eating disorders, one of the common qualities of eating disorders is a sense of body dysmorphia, which means that there's a highly unrealistic perception of one's body. So for example, a person who has anorexia might be extraordinarily thin, but might claim that they have love handles, or that they're fat, or that they have fat on their arms or on their belly. And there's often a profound dislike of one's body as well. There are different sort of approaches to how eating disorders can manifest. Sometimes they can manifest as a very strong need for control, whereas other times it can be a spiraling out of control. Anorexia nervosa, or anorexia as it's more commonly called, tends to stem from a very strong need for control. So sometimes people with anorexia might feel as if they don't have control over other parts of their lives, but what they can control is how they feed themselves. And people with anorexia nervosa reduce their eating to the point where the body weight is significantly low or less than minimally expected. And it can result in severe starvation and sometimes even result in death. Bulimia tends to be marked by spiraling out of control, and bulimia is often marked by cycles of binging, where people might overeat enormous amounts of food in one sitting and then use unhealthy methods such as excessive exercise or purging in order to avoid weight gain. Binge eating disorder is where there's just uncontrolled binge eating without the purging involved. So one of the greatest risk factors of eating disorders is someone being an adolescent or a young adult female. That tends to be a very high risk for developing eating disorders. That being said, eating disorders can occur among men, especially male athletes. So whenever there is an athletic area, a sport that involves weight limits, so for example, boxing, or certain types of fighting where you have to meet certain weight standards, there can often be a very unhealthy focus on weight and unhealthy methods used to achieve certain weight, and that can lead to an eating disorder. I actually knew a former male student of mine who had struggled with eating disorders in high school, and so this is not unique to women. It's interesting to note that we can pick up a lot of signs of beauty standards and what's considered to be sufficient body image and body size by looking at the media we consume. And it's interesting to note how thin our models are compared to the average body size, and how comparing ourselves against that unrealistic standard can often lead us coming up short. There's this really heartbreaking video, I'll see if I can link you to it, where a person tries to ask a series of very young girls how their body image compares to others around them. And most girls overemphasized how fat they were compared to the other girls around them and saw an ideal body weight as much thinner than they actually were. And these were girls that were 8 and 9. So it can start fairly early. There can also be genetic components. So if you have a family history, that can contribute. So let's switch gears from eating disorders to schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is a severe disorder, and it's also a fairly rare disorder. About 1% of people have schizophrenia. It can be managed with therapy and with treatment, and we're going to talk about how that's managed later on when we talk about therapies. That being said, schizophrenia is often massively misunderstood, so we're going to be addressing that a little bit in this particular unit. I've also provided some videos that you can watch portraying some of the symptoms of schizophrenia, so go ahead and check those out. Schizophrenia can be defined as a disorder associated with disordered thinking, bizarre behavior, and hallucinations, where people are unable to distinguish between fantasy and reality. And sometimes this can lead to what's known as a psychotic break. And a psychotic break is where there's a break away from an ability to perceive what is real and what is fantasy. So, for example, there can be a very elaborate delusion about somebody trying to persecute you, and then there can be hallucinations that can feed that particular delusion, and an inability to determine what is real and what is not, that the voices you heard were actually something that you invented rather than a real presence. So when it comes to delusions, delusions can take different forms. There's also different types of schizophrenia. So paranoid schizophrenia would be specifically prone to delusions. But let's go ahead and go through some of these delusions a little bit. So delusions of persecution would be a delusion where somebody believes that people are after them, that the FBI is tapping their phones, that they're being followed, that they're being observed or monitored. Now, I will go ahead and say once again, context is everything. That Julian Assange, when he was holed up in his embassy home, was really under surveillance. And some people are being surveilled. If they have those beliefs, that can sometimes be true. But most people are not under active, constant surveillance to the degree to which someone with schizophrenia believes that they are. Delusions of reference might be this notion that something might be a signal to them or be referring to them. So a news report about a person is actually about them. Somebody calling out someone in vague terms elsewhere is actually talking about them. Delusions of influence, that they can influence the weather, that they can influence other people. So that can be delusions, a form of delusion. Delusions of grandeur. Once again, not everyone is the target of an FBI investigation. People with paranoid schizophrenia can often place themselves in the center of a very grand conspiracy where they are the linchpin or star of this conspiracy, and the entire world revolves around them in an elaborate sort of plot that involves hundreds of people all conspiring against them at the highest levels of power, and that once again they are in the center of all of this. Now, some people are at the center of a lot of once again a lot of surveillance, but they tend to be very distinct individuals who are often public figures. Your everyday person is not at the center of a massive conspiracy, and so it's important to understand that this is when it's not based in reality. Another symptom of schizophrenia can be speech and thought disturbances. So one of the videos I've linked to is someone demonstrating this tendency to have rambling speech that doesn't tend to make a great deal of sense. It can often be thought of as word salad. That's what it's called sometimes, where meaning is a little lost and it's hard to follow that person's speech. So hallucinations are false sensory perceptions that feed paranoid delusions. So for example, if you believe that you're being monitored by the FBI as part of a delusion, then the person who's schizophrenic might hear chatter from a radio that mentions their name, or might actually hear voices in their head confirming a delusion that they have. These voices are often negative and very judgmental. So it isn't necessarily somebody saying, good job, nicely done. It's usually somebody saying, they're out to get you, something like that. Auditory hallucinations are far more common than visual hallucinations. When schizophrenia is portrayed in the media, usually it's portrayed with visual hallucinations, because usually it's portrayed by a visual medium, and that tends to be a little bit more interesting to look at rather than just hearing voices. I once talked to somebody who was schizophrenic, and he said that when he had his first episode, the thing that he saw was his deceased grandmother everywhere he went. He would just see her in the background, and he knew that she was deceased, and it was a really surreal and difficult thing for him. It was disconcerting. It was odd, and he didn't care for it. Now, he was able to manage his symptoms once again, and he's able to function perfectly normally these days. But you can imagine how disconcerting that can be. So we can divide the symptoms of schizophrenia into two different broad categories. The first is positive symptoms, and the second is negative symptoms. Now, this is very similar to positive and negative reinforcement in that when I use the word positive, I don't mean good, and when I use the word negative, I don't mean bad. Rather, I mean adding something or taking something away. So in the case of positive symptoms, those are usually excesses of behavior that occur in addition to normal behavior. So if you're hearing voices, if you're engaging in hallucinations, if you have rambling, excessive speech, those are all examples of positive symptoms. So hallucinations, delusions, distorted thinking, that's an excess. You're adding something to the environment. In the case of negative symptoms, that's taking something away. So sometimes people might exhibit negative symptoms where it's an absence of normal behavior. Now, it's interesting to note that sometimes people experience only positive symptoms, sometimes they experience only negative symptoms, and sometimes it's a mix of both. So when I'm talking about negative symptoms, one of the things that you can note with negative symptoms would be an inability to pay attention. When I say flat affect, that means that someone is not displaying emotion on their face. You might also have poor speech production, so challenges with starting to talk. There's also movement issues that people can sometimes exhibit. Catatonia means that someone is catatonic. They don't necessarily respond to stimulation. If you poke them, they don't feel it or appear to feel it. They don't respond to lights. There's difficulty initiating movement sometimes with these negative symptoms. So for example, if you were to tell someone, could you walk across the room for me? They would have a lot of challenge starting to walk. But if you were to lift their leg and then set it down in front of them, they would be able to start moving. You also see an odd posing or waxy flexibility. So if you were to pose someone who has a great deal of negative symptoms, they would stay in that pose for hours without any apparent discomfort. I've attached a video for this week that shows some of these negative symptoms so you can see what they look like. I find it interesting that when we portray schizophrenia, we very rarely address these negative symptoms. We usually focus on the positive ones when we portray it in film because, once again, this is far more interesting to explore. When it comes to the causes of schizophrenia, the causes tend to be fairly biological. So one of the things we know, for example, is that people with schizophrenia tend to have higher amounts of dopamine in their system. When we talk about treatment of schizophrenia, one of the things we'll talk about is how antipsychotics reduce dopamine, which directly impact the hallucinations that people with schizophrenia can experience. So a higher amount of dopamine is associated with hallucinations. Treating the dopamine tends to help manage those hallucinations. Another marker of schizophrenia is enlarged ventricles, which once again would suggest a more biological underlying component to schizophrenia. When you look at the brain on the left versus the brain on the right, down below in the picture, the brain on the left is someone without schizophrenia, and the brain on the right is someone with schizophrenia. And you'll notice the main differences are the two marks in the middle of each hemisphere cortex. So you see the marks on the left are much smaller than the marks on the right, which look a little bit like apple seeds. These are ventricles. They're passages through which fluid flows, and you can see how the ventricles are enlarged on the right, which is once again the brain of someone with schizophrenia. So people with schizophrenia tend to have a different shape to their brain, which is one thing you can see with imaging. Often there are triggers in terms of maternal infection to things like rubella, herpes, or toxoplasmosis. So if the mother was infected with these while they were pregnant, the child in question has a greater likelihood of developing schizophrenia later. Schizophrenia is also associated with inflammation, so sometimes it can be triggered after an inflammatory illness. And it is highly heritable. So most disorders have a certain degree of heritability, but schizophrenia has a very high degree of heritability. I almost said, anyways, it has a higher degree of heritability, where if you have a family history of it, you are also more likely to be at risk for developing it yourself. It tends to be a little bit more sex-linked, so men are more common in terms of the number of people who are schizophrenic. There's more men than women. And you can have a family history of related disorders like schizotypal or schizoaffective disorder, which we'll talk about in the next video, and that also increases your likelihood of potentially developing schizophrenia. So it does have that heritability component. The stress vulnerability model is one that you often see with biological predispositions to any sort of disease or disorder. And the stress vulnerability model would state that you might have a biological sensitivity or vulnerability due to genetics that then might be triggered by an environmental or emotional stress. So for example, developing severe inflammatory illness might be that trigger that makes you more likely to develop that disorder. You might already have the underlying propensity to develop due to your genetics. It's also interesting to note that people who have schizophrenia are also more likely to have had a past involving abuse and neglect